So welcome to our second video for our online American Popular Music course. Today we're going to be discussing the sources of American popular music because American popular music has quite a few different sources that make it sound like it sounds. So I thought the focus of today's lecture would be simply talking about what were the things that people brought with them when they settled the United States that formed the music that we have. If you've studied history, then you sort of know that starting in the age of exploration or so, and when we're talking about the founding of America and stuff, a lot of what we talk about is who was here, who came here, who was brought here, and what did they bring with them. And part of what they brought with them would be their music. So that's the focus that we're going to be going into in this particular video. And basically what this video is going to address is trying to answer the question, so where did the music come from? The music that we have come to know as our popular music today, because it can trace its history back to the people who settled America in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So hopefully you know your American history fairly well, because that's going to certainly come in and help you. Because if you understand American history, then you sort of understand that really when we're talking about American history in the 17, 18, 1900s, what we're talking about is the idea of America being settled by people from many different countries. You know, a lot of European settlers, but of course also people who were brought here from Africa who are brought to the United States. And of course then there are other cultures as well, such as Asian and things like that. But really when we're looking at the sources of American popular music, we're looking at what European settlers and enslaved Africans had to bring to it. And from the Europeans and the Africans, there are really three very distinct musical strains that we have happening. This would be the music that they knew when they left their homelands to come to America, and this would be the music they brought with them. One of those things is what I'm terming European art music. And if you're wondering what the heck is European art music, it's basically what we think of as classical music. That's one source. The second source is folk music, particularly folk music from the British Isles, folk music from Ireland, Scotland, England. Now, there are people from other European countries who settle America, of course, and there would be there would be Italian folk music and Polish folk music and stuff too. But really the stuff that has the greatest impact is the folk music that's brought from the British Isles. And the third thing to have a really strong impact is African music. And I want to spend some time speaking about and listening to examples of all those musical types and talking about what characterizes those musical types and what aspects of those are going to be used to build popular music. So when we talk about European art music or classical music, a lot of us have a good sense of what that is. And probably for many of us, when we think about classical music, what we think about is very big music, like a symphony orchestra with maybe 80 people on the stage performing a long instrumental work, or an opera where you've got people on the stage acting out a story and an orchestra hidden down under the stage accompanying them. And those are certainly important aspects of classical music, but there are smaller classical music forms that actually have a greater bearing on popular music. One of them would be what we call the aria, which is an Italian word. And basically an aria is a song from an opera. And, you know, if you think about how Broadway musicals work, a lot of times a Broadway musical will have like 15 songs in it or so. And of those 15 songs, some are going to become more popular than others. Think about a musical like Cats or something like that. And from Cats, the song that sort of becomes the big hit single, as it were, is Memory. So there's sort of these songs that come out of these larger works like musicals that become sort of hit songs on their own. Well, that also happened with operas. in the 17 and 1800s. A lot of times an opera would have a song in it called an aria, and that would be something that people would maybe hear at the performance, and it would stick with them, and they would want to hear that song more. So what might happen then is they would go out and purchase the sheet music, and they could take it home, and if somebody in their house knew how to play the piano and knew how to sing, then they could have those songs in their home and have them not having to go to the opera. And a similar thing to that is a German version of a song that we call a Lied, L-I-E-D, which is basically a song with a piano accompaniment. And again, those songs were very useful in the 19th century because people could purchase the sheet music, and folks who knew how to read music and had pianos in their homes could play them on the piano and other people could sing. And that gave people a chance to experience music outside of large concert settings. And another thing that really weighs on American popular music is just the idea of the instruments that happen in classical music. There are instruments from classical music like the piano or the violin that are going to be present in popular music in the 19th century and the 20th century. So the thing that really distinguishes European art music is what I'm going to say is its aesthetic concept. The idea people have about classical music, which is that this type of music is a cultivated skill. Being able to play it requires training. It requires formal lessons, usually. It requires lots of practice and lots of study. But there's even that idea that being able to listen to it requires a degree of training and stuff. That's why we have classes like music appreciation in college and stuff, so that people who say things like, I don't understand classical music, can take a class where maybe somebody teaches them, here are the things you want to listen to when you hear this music. Here's what you want to take note of in the melody. Notice these themes. Notice how the instrumentation varies and things like that. Really, it's sort of like it's the listening version of wine tasting. If you know people who are really into wine, then you know how they do things like, take the wine and hold it in their mouth and roll it over their palate and sort of extract the different flavors and say pretentious little things like, oh, I can taste this nutty undertaste and a hint of oak or things like that. Being able to listen to classical music is a little like that because people sort of learn how to savor what's going on in a classical composition. They learn how to appreciate the counterpoint and the interplay of the instruments. But there's this concept that classical music is something that not only do you need to learn to play, but you sort of need to have a little bit of background and study and being able to listen to it. Really, it's sort of summed up by that quote that just popped up on the slide, the idea that not everyone can do it. And one way where that's really, really apparent in classical music is in the singing style, a style that we call the bel canto style of singing, which is an Italian term that just means literally beautiful chant or beautiful song. And it's basically what a lot of people refer to as opera voice. But it's that style of singing where people go and they spend a long time studying and learning how to articulate syllables the right way and how to control their breath and how to make the beautiful vocal tone that characterizes classical music. So I'm guessing that it might be a good idea for us to perhaps think about listening to some classical music. And that's what's playing now. This is a Bellini opera from the early 1800s. And here's the bel canto vocal style. The vocal style sounds very highly trained, very professional. Of course, not only is her singing style very refined and cultivated, so is the instrumental style of all those violins and cellos in the orchestra. When we hear a piece of music like this, And I think most of us, when we hear it, understand that the person who's performing this didn't just pick it up on the side, but it's somebody who's done a lot of study and somebody who works on a professional level. And this was a style of music that European settlers from the 17 and 1800s would have known, would have brought with them. The music that was printed and published at this time was sort of geared toward people who were trained to read music, and this was sort of the idea that this was the quote-unquote right way to do music. And this is one of those things that exerts an influence on popular music. But on the other side of the coin, Europeans also brought their folk music with them, which is a very unrefined style of music. If the idea behind classical music is that it requires training, it requires practice, it requires devotion and all that, the idea behind folk music is different. The idea behind folk music is that music is not a cultivated skill. You don't really have to have a lot of training to be able to play it, and you certainly don't have to have a lot of training to be able to listen to it. You just have to want to listen to some music. But people who perform it also often come at it from a sort of a non-professional perspective. If you want to sing that song, sing that song. Do it the best you can. Don't worry about going to school and practicing forever and finding a teacher. Just do what you can. The singing style is very natural. It's much more in tune with what people's speaking voices is, as opposed to that bel canto classical style that's a very, very trained style. If the idea behind classical music is sort of summed up in the quote that not everyone can do it, the idea behind folk music performance is the idea that anyone can do it. And they don't necessarily do it wanting to be professional musicians. Sometimes people just sing folk songs wanting to, have something to pass the time while they're doing their jobs or whatever. But, the concept behind folk music is different. With classical music, when we hear a classical composition, we usually are right to make the assumption that there is a person out there, a composer, who created that piece of music and wrote it down and transmitted it to performers who know how to read what he or she wrote and interpret it. With folk songs, they don't always work that way. A lot of folk songs are never written down. We don't actually necessarily know who made them up. They just get passed around by oral tradition because people like them, and you learn this song because your mother learned this song because her grandfather sang this song, and it passes on that way. And the performance style of it is much more uncultivated and much more natural. And we'll listen to one of those right now. So this is a folk music performance. I think it was made in the early 20th century, and I believe it was made up around Asheville, North Carolina. This is an old folk song called Old Joe Clark. You're going to hear the same instruments we just heard, violins or fiddles, and you're going to hear a singer.
I went to see my honey, babe, she's standing in the door. Shoes and stockings in her hand and the feet all over the floor. Well, old Joe Clark, goodbye, Betsy Brown. Well, old Joe Clark, I'm bound to leave this town.
Okay, so we're not going to think that's classical bel canto singing. We might think it's good folk singing, but it's a different thing. And his voice is much more natural, nasal sounding. You can hear him sort of scooping up the notes where he goes, "Whoa, Joe Clark," and stuff like that. And the playing on the violin here, on the fiddle here, is a different way of approaching that instrument than a classical violinist would take as well. And of course that folk music performance has a much more direct style to it. It really does sort of make us think more of that idea of anyone can do it, that the people who are playing it may not be professional musicians, but maybe people who do this as a sideline. And that sort of makes a nice bridge between classical music and African music, because when we're looking at African music, we're looking at something that's really quite different from European art music or European folk music. There are different things about African music that make it sound very different and make the way people think about it be very different as well. You know, one thing that makes it sound different is it's a very percussive style of music. It's got a lot of drums in it, and a lot of the instruments that are used in African music are instruments that are played by being struck with beaters or sticks or something like that. Instruments that look like sort of the ancestors of our modern xylophone, or drums that people play with their hands and things like that. So there's a lot of percussiveness in African music, much more so than in European music of the art music form or the folk music form. Like Mozart, he didn't ever write a lot of highly percussive music, but you can certainly find a lot of highly percussive music in African music. And another thing that makes it different is there's this communal aspect of music in African music. The idea that when music is happening, everybody is participating. Very different from classical music, which is sort of a type of music where you have performers who are active in performing the music, and you have an audience that is passive in receiving the music. That's not the case in African music. And there's also a sense in which African music is a communicative type of music. The drumming, sometimes in African music, some African musical societies actually use the drums to send messages, and people will hear different patterns played on the drums, and they'll think thoughts that aren't specifically musical. They'll think, oh, that drumming means that there's a storm coming, or that drumming means that it's a celebration day, or that drumming means that there's danger about. So their music is more directly communicative. And this is a really neat thing about African music, is that it's sort of embedded in the language and in the way people speak. A lot of African languages are what we refer to as tonal languages, which means that when you're speaking, if you're speaking in an African language, you don't necessarily just try to say the words and get the syllables right, but there's an actual pitch element to the word, an actual contour that's important. And that the same syllables can have different meanings if you speak them with a different contour. For instance, if I said language, or if I said language, those might be very different words because the tonality or the pitch pattern goes differently. And because African dialects, African languages often have this tonal aspect where to be able to just speak, you need to be able to like modulate your voice and change pitch. That means that the line between singing and speaking is much more blurry. One place where you find it is that in a lot of African vocal music, there's this idea that we call call and response, which is this sense that there will be a main musician or a main performer who might sing something, and then the people who are assembled who are listening will sing it back. And the main singer singing it is the call, and the people singing it back is the response. And it's actually something that persists in the popular music well into the 20th century and 21st century. In fact, this is an Aretha Franklin song from the 1960s. And you can hear that there's a call and response going on between Aretha and her choir. Listen. Here she comes giving the call. Now, response, call, and that's the response. Let's go back, let's go way back when. I didn't even know you couldn't have been too much more than 10. Just tell me. I ain't no psychiatrist, I ain't no doctor with degrees, but it don't take too much time to see what you're doing to me. You gotta think about what you're trying to do to me, yeah. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Call, response, call, response. And again. See what I mean? Needless to say, this is going to mean that there's a definite different aesthetic concept operating in African music. If the aesthetic concept in classical music is that idea of performers and audience, the idea that music is something to be appreciated as music, separately from other things. That's not really something that exists in African music at all. In African music, the idea is more that music is everywhere. Music is going on all the time. Music is a very, very natural part of life. And musical things become an outgrowth of other things people do. So, I mean, that's very, very apparent when I talk about how this is a tonal language. And the idea that when you speak in a tonal language, you're not just saying words, but you're in a sense singing a little bit. And that it's really this idea that, everybody does music. Very different from how we think about the classical concept of music, which is that leave it to the pros. The professionals do it and the audience appreciates it. But not so in African music. If the concept behind classical music is not everyone can do it, and the concept behind folk music is that anyone can do it, really the quote that best sums up how music might be viewed in African life is, how can you not do it? You have to sing a little bit when you speak, in a sense. You have to participate when music happens. And because of that, people have music going on all the time. Here's something that's really kind of neat sounding. I'm just going to let it play. It's very percussive, as is a lot of African music. It's very tuneful, very nice, and what it actually is, it's not a concert performance or anything. What that is that's a recording of African postal workers, and what they're doing is they're using those little rubber ink stamps to cancel stamps on letters. But you can see that what they've done is they've sort of turned it into this little musical ritual, this thing that sort of whiles away the time, because the idea isn't that music is something that you break off what you're doing and listen to and participate in, but instead it's the idea that music can be happening all the time. And that's a very different way of thinking about music. And I want to just look a little bit more at some of these aspects of African music. For instance, since I talk about it being highly percussive, I've got these pictures here that do a fairly good job of illustrating that, because if you look at these pictures, then you can see that the upper two pictures especially show African musical performers with percussion instruments. There's that line of drummers down there in the middle of the page, and up on the upper side of the page there's a guy playing a thing that looks kind of xylophone-ish. It's a kalimba is what it is. There's a man standing next to him with a skin drum, and these pictures sort of show us how prominent percussion instruments are in African music. Now, the guy on the lower right-hand corner there is not playing a percussion instrument. He's playing like a stringed instrument, like a lute-type instrument. But these are Songhay Gulu drummers from Africa, and here's some example of the music they play. I think this qualifies as being highly percussive. In fact, there's not a melody or any harmony going on at all. The music creates its interest entirely by the rhythmic interplay of the percussion instruments. So that's a good example of the percussive nature of African music. And here's another good example to illustrate this idea of language and tonal language, and the idea of how the idea that there is singing and there is speaking, which is not singing, doesn't really compute in the African way of thinking about music as much. I'm going to play a recording of a griot, that's G-R-I-O-T, which in a lot of African musical circles, or a lot of African social circles actually, is a person who has a lot of cultural clout with the group, somebody who is sort of like a holy man or a medicine man or something like that. And a griot will often do things like pass on stories that have been passed down through oral tradition. It's the person who, is sort of the keeper of the collective memory of the group and stuff like that. And this is a griot telling a story, and he's accompanying himself on a stringed instrument like the one that the man at the bottom of the slide you're looking at has. But I want you to listen to what happens, because he's strumming his instrument, telling us this story. And as he does that, his voice sort of crosses back and forth between being like conversational speaking and being singing. Listen. And here's the voice. Very conversational, like speech.
Sama jas nang mani jas nang ngoni jas sama ga des ak may de wandi bu fu sang nas njugo jom nas payam sama ter muji ma do bu fu jur ka ba sa bay kiru geeru salula
Sort of like singing and speech combined. Very much singing. So you can sort of see how for this fellow, the performance he's doing, the story he's telling, involves him using his voice both the way I'm using mine now to just, perhaps convey information in a conversational way, but then also to suddenly, cross over into the land of singing. And if you're thinking, well, yeah, so that's a thing they do in Africa, big whoop, how does that affect popular music? Listen to what's coming up here next. This is a recording, I believe, from the 1930s by a blues singer from Atlanta named Blind Willie McTell. And like a lot of early blues guys, the way he performed is he just accompanied himself by playing his guitar as he did his songs. But I want you to listen to this song called Travelin' Blues, and I want you to think about what we just heard with that griot story and how the guy was strumming on an instrument, accompanying himself, and telling us a story that sort of moved from conversational to singing and back and forth. And listen to what Blind Willie does here now. Here we go.
I was traveling through South America. Walked up to a lady's house, called her grandma. Didn't know her name. She gave me something to eat. Walked on down the road. I heard old train getting off like this.
So really what he's doing now is very conversational, very information-oriented with his voice.
I heard old bell ring kind of like this. I went on down, I heard old whistle blow. I heard it said, look yonder. Look yonder.
He's kind of singing now, ain't he?
At the women. At the women. I went on then, I began to sing to the engineer. Mr. Engineer, let a man ride the line. Mr. Engineer, let a poor man ride the line. And I wouldn't mind it, fella, but you know this train ain't mine.
Okay, so that's kind of interesting, isn't it? It creates a rather clear parallel to that African musician we heard before Blind Willie there. And this is something that persists and survives when Africans are brought over to the Americas in the 17 and 1800s. Some of these ideas about how music works managed to survive, and they managed to then go into shaping popular music in the 18 and 1900s. And that example by Blind Willie McTell there is a really good example of this idea of the view that somebody takes toward the voice is not just it can talk or it can sing, but it sort of goes back and forth between those two things. And this really brings us to the end of this video. You need to go on and watch the next video. And in the next video, we're actually going to really start talking about the history of American popular music. And we're going to start in the 1800s and discuss the important musical genres in the 1800s that are going to become shaping forces of popular music in the 20th century. So I'll see you all in the next video.